I am Mahnaz Yousefzadeh, Professor of Global Liberal Studies at New York University and affiliate faculty at NYU Abu Dhabi this year. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Catherine Miller, who joins NYU Abu Dhabi this year as a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Humanities Fellowship. This evening, Dr. Miller presents her current research entitled Risky Business, a study of Christian-Muslim relations in the medieval Mediterranean. After receiving her PhD in history at Yale in 1998, Dr. Miller joined the Stanford University faculty and was a history professor of medieval Mediterranean until 2010, when she moved to Jordan as a Fulbright senior scholar at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Since 2013, Dr. Miller has served as Associate Professor of History and International Studies at the Center for Strategic Studies of University of Jordan, specializing in international human rights, women's and religious minority rights, and migration. Dr. Miller's first book, Guardians of Islam, Religious Authority and Muslim Communities of Late Medieval Spain, published with Columbia University Press in 2008, uses a range of legal sources and Arabic manuscript fragments to reconstruct the networks that connected the Iberian Muslims to those in North African lands. She has published several articles and book chapters on Islamic medicine, Islamic law, and Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages. These include, is entitled Reflections on Reciprocity, Perspectives on Christian-Muslim Commitment to Captive Exchange, which was published in 2014. Dr. Miller has several works in progress, including a medieval Muslim Machiavelli, Abu Faris Abdul Aziz II, and Hafsid Port of Tunis, Migration, Minorities, and Rule of Law, a comparative study of legal pluralism in medieval Mediterranean, and Cultural Heritage and Armed Conflict in the Middle East, a historical perspective. Her research for Guardians of Islam has led to long-term interest in the cultural intermediaries. She presents her current book project tonight, which is a study of formal and informal exchanges between Christians and Muslims in the ransoming of captives. I present Dr. Miller.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Mahfaz. I'd also like to begin with a thank you to Alex Sandu, Martin Klimke, Rander Falkenberg for this opportunity to devote this year to research and writing. You've been so welcoming and generous in your support. There's a small caveat here. This is very much a work in progress. I had initially written a talk that covered my recent work here in the past 3 months and what I had to say about the role of trust in Christian-Muslim partnerships, with a specific focus on trade partnerships and captive ransoming. It turned out to be almost 2 hours. So there are massive cuts, but I look forward to the question and answer session afterwards. If anyone has a question about sources from the Spanish archives or North African archives that I use, for instance, or anything else, please don't hesitate. You can write your questions in the margins in the middle of the talk if you'd like, and then we will discuss this at the end. So thank you very much. I framed my talk today around why I chose risky business as a title with emphasis on methodology. But I begin with captivity first. A practice, perhaps almost as old as sea travel, the captive trade flourished along the coasts of North Africa and eastern Spain during the Middle Ages. Captivity was the product of religious warfare, piracy, and violence between Christian and Muslims. In some cases, captives were taken out of fear. An enemy traveling in foreign lands, for example, posed a security risk. In battle, the victors imprisoned the vanquished for prize and profit. Military incursions would surround and capture a town's entire population. Pirates and corsairs routinely intercepted pilgrims as they sailed eastward. Others were snatched from their homeland along the shores of North Africa or Spain. Even merchants conducting commercial business in foreign ports ran the risk of being seized and detained if relations between their homeland and host country had soured. There's a lot of drama. Generations of scholars have gravitated toward the surviving, often colorful stories of Muslims and Christians who found themselves in chains, a fearful and heart-rending predicament that was all too common. The individuals who rescued these captives, however, are less visible in the records. Typically, some brave redeemer who traveled to enemy lands to liberate a co-legionary. There are countless cases of efforts to rescue and redeem these captives. Diplomats with peace treaties, middlemen carrying the ransom paid by families, sultans and kings who used captives as bargaining chips in trade deals. Religious orders dedicated to saving Christians and Muslims from the infidels. Some of these rescue negotiations were successful, some were not. While security measures were taken and safe conducts issued by respective Muslim and Christian authorities, a captive redeemer was taking considerable risks in choosing to involve himself. Risky business explores the many points of exchange and engagement between Christians and Muslims through the lens of captive ransoming, a risky business, and the middleman, negotiators, traders, and diplomats involved in the human commerce. It was risky because at any step of the process, a misunderstanding, a retraction of an offer, a demand for more money, or a missing or runaway captive, and the list could go on, could undermine a transaction. Ransom money paid, but no captives handed over. What lightened the risk of failed deals? So I structure my talk around the following questions. What do we know about the individual actors, the Christian and Muslim middleman who handle these exchanges? Were there laws or guidelines that oversaw the transaction? Was the threat of punishment enough to discourage opportunism? Were successful exchanges owed to trusty intermediaries? And were these exchanges regulated, and if so, how? There were many deals that could go wrong. One, for example, are captives who were taken for only profit and which often violated the laws of war. What mechanisms were used to lessen the risk of opportunistic behavior such as that? What role did trust play in captive ransoming? How is trust built and maintained across social groups among players who would seem to have a strong incentive to renege on agreements with each other? What pressures were imposed by Muslim and Christian authorities or their communities on their intermediaries to strike a deal? What were the commitment problems and how were they surmounted? Independent Christian and Muslim agents mediated between parties and performed a variety of tasks. They transported captives, paid shipping, immigration fees, bribes, taxes, mediating between parties, and setting price and credit terms by which a captive would be exchanged or sold. The majority of redemption transactions involved individual intermediaries or middlemen, often merchants, sometimes Christian friars, diplomats, and sometimes traveling Muslim scholars, sometimes member of the captive's family. Rarely do we see ransom money being paid to a captor without some form of intervention. The professional mediators, known as fakak in Arabic and el fakiki in Spanish, negotiated the price, the terms of release, the transfer of funds, and the majority of cases personally supervised an exchange of captives or other captives or money, for other captives or money. Why is this risky? At any step of the redemption process, there could be a demand that undermine the transaction. Despite the risks, seasoned middlemen develop ways of negotiating while anticipating the many ways in which a deal could turn sour. Ambassadors were sometimes dispatched to royal courts to negotiate exorbitant sums. They had to prove themselves as dependable and trustworthy emissaries for both sides. Men of religious orders, such as the Christian Mercedarians, the Qadis, the legal scholars, traveled to foreign lands and negotiated also for the release. Frequently, families went in search for their infidel captives that they could exchange for their loved one in captivity. This also could happen on a grand scale. A Christian king might invade a border town and take 300 hostages, for example. In response, the Sultan, hoping to cut through the difficulties of captive redemption, would sue for peace. Ambassadors would be dispatched to respective royal courts. The ransom of the Muslim captives or their exchange for Christian prisoners would be arranged, often accompanied by the presentation of gifts and other diplomatic courtesies. Of course, the best laid plans could topple overnight. A diplomat who fell ill while abroad, or a chief emissary detained by border officials, or a messenger bearing important documents seized by pirates could capsize meticulously arranged efforts to free prisoners. Treaties that supported safe passages whereby agents could freely cross borders and captives return home would be quickly dissolved upon the death of their ruler or when a treaty is not renewed. In principle, Christian and Muslims agreed that captive exchange should operate in an orderly fashion, guided by mutually agreed conventions and regulated by bilateral institutions. As we know, each side developed processes that enabled Christians and Muslims respectfully to raise and channel funds to the infidels for redemption. The Mercedarians, founded for the exclusive purpose of redeeming Christian captives, established bylines and guidelines for the friars to follow. Christian municipal organizations likewise established regulations for raising money for Christian prisoners. Muslim communities also turned to long-standing Islamic institutions and laws governing the ransoming process. Legal scholars specified the guidelines for fida, the resumption and ransom, and the qualifications necessary to be a fakak, the agent who redeems or negotiates the release of captives. According to Islamic formularies, a contract collection which would validate the fakik status of a professional captive redeemer, the fakak should be a trustworthy man. So if the system was to function efficiently, the challenge for Christian and Muslims was to convince the other party and the intermediaries to deal in a trustworthy fashion. These exchanges were potentially always at risk. Incentives for opportunism did exist, and Muslims and Christians engaged in captive redemption certainly had reason not to act in a trustworthy fashion. Either party might be tempted to cheat the other, increase the ransom amount unexpectedly, after the conditions of the contract, even perhaps recapture a captive after she or he had been ransomed. An agent could play with the fluctuation of currencies, particularly with its devaluation, to make a profit at the expense of those who had donated the ransom funds. Or eager for profit, a Christian or Muslim agent could always pocket the ransom money. Other problems would also undermine the exchange process in the short or in the long run. For example, captives taken during a truce period, which was theoretically forbidden, the Sultan or kings mishandle or confiscate the merchant boats and refuse to allow exchanges, captives could renege on contracts or captives killed. There can be the conversion of captives, as we see occasionally happen. In practice, this meant that all Christians and Muslim actors needed to recognize and surmount what economic historians have called the, quote, fundamental problem of exchange, or FPOE. Two factors must be in play for sustaining exchanges over a period of time. First, both parties must be convinced that the exchange can be mutually beneficial. Second, each party must commit to fulfill its contractual obligations. What I will call the commitment problem did not exist solely between Christians and Muslims, but also within each religious group. Abuse of the exchange process could take place among Christians and among Muslims. The potential commitment problems were: one, no funds forthcoming. Families and communities did not give money for ransoms because they did not have confidence in the exchange process. Mercenaries, for example, could use family funds to ransom another captive, not a member of the family. Two, Christian captives could overcharge Christian families who needed to buy a Muslim captive to exchange for a family member. Captives liberated against the promise of later funds might not pay back their rescuers. Despite such handicaps, however, captive commerce flourished, and with it the formal and informal institutions that supported the redemptive practices. Successful exchanges were made again and again. Agents belonging to various social groups cultivated reputations of trustworthiness. I am confronted thus with an interesting problem of explaining a system's functioning. How did Christian and Islamic institutions respectively surmount the commitment problem in the later Middle Ages to facilitate a mutually beneficial exchange? One of my aims, therefore, is to examine the institutions that create trust between social groups that a priori have no reason to trust one another. This entails a systematic study of the commitment mechanisms that affect trustworthy behavior of Muslim and Christian ransoming agents in a specific context. In my context here, it will be the commercial routes between Valencia, Spain. Later, I will be looking at Marseille and Venice and Tunis during the late 14th and 15th centuries. My study will seek to identify the essential reasons why late medieval agents charged with negotiation ransoms generally did not renege on their contractual obligations. I examine the commitment mechanisms that were worked to prevent such opportunistic behavior. So today I will discuss two cases, documents that I found in the archives that reflect the different contexts in which trust is built. First is a Muslim merchant living in Valencia, a busy port on the east coast of Spain at the end of the 14th century. The second is the emir, sometimes called Sultan, of Tunis, also at the end of the 14th century. First, a little background on the commitment problem. What formal and informal institutions were in place at this time to discourage opportunistic behavior? What made the Western Mediterranean distinct from a lawless and chaotic Wild West frontier? What follows is a brief sketch of the debate that emerged over the past 20 years on how societies can build cultures of trust. The last decade has seen a significant body of social scientific literature that addresses what is termed the commitment problem. That is, studies of how commitment mechanisms function or fail to function in different historically and culturally determined contexts. Which includes political systems, formal and informal institutions, governments, and so forth. In particular, economic historians focusing on trade of all sorts in the medieval Mediterranean have explored institutions and mechanisms that surmounted commitment problems and thereby supporting the expansion of trade between the 10th and the 15th centuries. More broadly, these scholars are investigating whether trust can be distinguished from other means of promoting cooperation. Such means include, to serve in this example, contracts that align incentives formally to social norms, and reputational networks that impose informal penalties on defectors. Some theorists would claim that trust is a social virtue that cannot be reduced to strategic self-interest. Others arguing that trusting another person is ultimately a rational calculation based on information about that person and the incentives they face. The economic historian Avner Greif has postulated that medieval Meribah traders inhabited a private order enforcement network in which the fear of losing one's reputation, his fama, as an honest dealer and a coalition member was enough to make it possible to trust an agent without a formal contract. Greif explores how coordinated efforts against opportunism was a result of informal structures, such as friendship, reputation, and the flow of information that compelled traders to act in an honest and trustworthy manner. Others disagree. Shaile Ogilvy and Jonathan Edwards claimed that the traders did in fact use courts to settle disputes, while Jessica Goldberg argues that in most cases, the fear of legal action proved sufficiently effective to encourage good behavior. In a West African context, Lucy Colvin argues for the tight government control of trade, suggesting the rulers regulated how and when markets could be established, what merchandise could be sold, and what price asked. And finally, other scholars have pointed towards family alliances and shared culture as playing a key factor in avoiding opportunism in transactions. The assumption that people of shared identity are inclined to trust one another, however, has lately been challenged by, among others, Francesca Trivellato, who casts doubt on the romanticized view of merchant communities as harmonious, cohesive, and full of pride. David Ashlanian regrets that trust has been posited as a given attribute of communities, not a factor requiring historical explanation. It does not require much of a conceptual leap to see how these studies by social scientists of the role of trust in commercial business in the medieval Mediterranean can also apply to medieval redemption practices, which is in itself a form of commerce. I will show, though, that there's an important difference. Social scientists have primarily studied commitment problems within homogeneous groups, like Greif's Meribah traders, an analytical framework suitable for investigating institutions that foster good behavior and trust across religious lines has not been sufficiently explored, especially in historical contexts and case studies. I give two examples here that give us the beginning of an answer. These two texts allow us to explore whether the commitment mechanisms put into place within homogeneous groups spilled over or influence the mechanisms put into place between different religious groups, in our case, Christians and Muslims. So the first case is the episode of the Meribah, a Sufi Sheikh in North Africa. The following passage is recounted by Zarkashi, a 15th century historian of the Hafsid dynasty, not long after Abu Faris's death in 1434. In 1423, the Christian ruler of Catalonia sent a messenger to Tunis, charged with launching peace negotiations. But since the Sultan Abu Faris was then in the Maghreb, the envoy sent back to Catalonia the military ship that had conveyed him so as to inform his master of Abu Faris's absence. The Catalan prince turned the ship back immediately to the envoy with the order to board back. He sent also a fleet of 50 units that operated by night, landing on the island of Corcana, taking advantage that the inhabitants were not worried. The latter numbered only about 2,000 men, women, and children, all included against 10,000 Christian fighting men. There was not in their island any city or a fort which they may have defended themselves. Still, they, the islanders, held fast, and in defending their lives and that of their women, killed about 400 of the attackers. But about 200 Muslims perished, and the remainder were captured. Thus, the Christians took over the island. Meanwhile, the Sultan had returned from the Maghreb and happened to be in Gafsa when he learned what the enemy fleet had done. He went forth, driving his army at full speed, and reached Fax at the same time as the Christian invaders. They asked the Sultan for safe conduct to come ashore and negotiate the Muslim captives' redemption. Their request was granted, and so 600 among the more important of them came to land. The Sultan offered to redeem the Muslims for 50,000 dinars, but this was refused. Then the Meribah, Ibn Abu Sanuna, went to the Sultan and harangued him. And I quote, "The Christians used deceit against you. For having dispatched an envoy to negotiate peace, they behave as we know. A traitor is not entitled to invoke a safe conduct. And my advice is that it's allowed to grant these men, the 600, and release them on condition of the liberation of the Muslims only." "No," said Abu Faras, "it shall not be said of me that I betray my word. God forbid that I should violate a safe conduct that I myself granted." "So then," answered the Arab, Ibn Abu Sanuna, "if it is not you, it will be I. Leave to go on a hunt, and I shall arrest them while you are away." But the prince refused, and the Christians re-embarked, taking with them their Muslim captives. No redemption took place. Abu Faras took considerable political risk among his own people in not arresting the Christian dignitaries and liberating the Muslim captives. Local Muslims must have been incensed by the treachery of the Catalans. The Meribah probably spoke for many when he urged Abu Faras to violate the safe conduct order. Yet, despite the pressure of the moment, Abu Faras clung to his long-term interests. If he violated the safe conduct, even in retaliation against the invasion, he risked losing his good name, his fama, and would face economic reprisals from Christian trading partners, including boycotts on his good or his harbor. Abu Faras obviously cared about his reputation within his own community, but extended this quest for esteem to the outgroup, the Christians, the Christian merchants. On the one hand, then, his sustaining of his original commitment made to the Christian raiders were based on his desire to maintain his reputation, thereby ensuring a lasting, profitable trade relationship with the Catalans. But we should note that forms of reputation could compete with and contradict each other. We find other situations with Muslims, like the Meribah Abu Ibn Sanuna, frown when any of their co-religionaries, especially their sultan, who extended olive branches of truce and friendship to the infidels. In this precise case, in the face of radical religious critique, Abu Faras preferred to uphold his reputation with the Catalans, a relationship he had nurtured over the years, as attested by other contemporary Christian sources. But another document reveals that other forces than social esteem may have been at play. For some years earlier, in 1397, following an act of piracy carried out from Bugia, an Italian lord felt compelled to sequester commodities from Tunis, in particular a significant shipment of oil, most of which belonged to the same Abu Faras, until the Sultan arranged for the liberation of the Christian taken captive in that incident. How the Sultan's willingness to exchange captives was inspired by coercive mechanisms, which Jessica Goldberg noted with some frequency in the Geniza documents of her study. These mechanisms, namely penalizing the Sultan with economic reprisals, prevented opportunism on the part of Abu Faras. While sultans were often religiously motivated to liberate Muslim prisoners, they worked under several constraints and had to balance diplomatic, economic, and military concerns with their religious duties. And however much they wanted to display their power and political savvy to their subjects, the ability to bring home Muslim captives was a highly laudable quality in a ruler, likely to endear him to many. They could not have always afford to do so or do so simply. Every opportunity to free captives could not be seized, especially if in the seizing a sultan might jeopardize his reputation and the trustworthiness needed for diplomatic action. In case number 2, Mudakhar merchants are middlemen between Christians and Muslims. I use the word Mudakhar because it connotes the subjugated minority Muslim communities in Spain after the Reconquista. So Muslims living under Christian rule. Mudakhar means those who stay. In 1461, a ship owned by Galceran de Requesens, he's a Christian, was piloted by his son and attacked by 6 corsair boats off the coast of Denia, Spain. Piled high with goods for export, the ship had originated from Valencia and was heading towards North African markets, where prominent Mudakhar merchant Mohammed Rapoy and his Christian partners planned to sell their wares. Mudakhar immigrants were also aboard. They managed to escape the pirates by swimming ashore, but then were subsequently imprisoned by Denia's officials in the Christian port. The pirates seized the ship's merchandise. Mohammed Rapoy and his partners complained bitterly to Christian officials. Not only were the seas too dangerous, but piracy was out of control. Mohammed decried the arrest of the Mudakhar immigrants who had registered with Valencian officials and paid for the necessary license to travel to North Africa. To extort ransom money from these Mudakhars was grossly unjust. Besides, Rapoy cried out emphatically, the stolen cargo and the ship's detainment in Denia meant that he would miss his business appointment in North Africa. Rapoy had, in fact, a lot to lose by the pirate attack. His merchandise was in the hands of corsairs. He feared reprisal in North African ports, and he also felt responsible for the immigrants aboard who were hoping to reach their homeland. Rapoy's family, his reputation as a reliable trader, as well as a protector of his co-religionaries, and his credibility had been tarnished. Pressured by Mohammed and his Christian partners, the Christian bailiff of Valencia demanded that the imprisoned immigrants be released immediately. With the support of the bailiff, Mohammed Rapoy and his colleagues demanded the return of their goods, the release of the captives, and assurance of secure passage in the future for merchants traveling to North Africa. The wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, however, and litigation continued for months. Ultimately, the immigrants were freed without ransom, and the cargo was returned to its owners. So, how did Mudakhar traders conduct profitable business under these conditions? Mohammed Rapoy's predicament was not uncommon. Research has shown that day-to-day operations of a Mudakhar merchant in Christian Spain were fraught with difficulties. Mudakhars were subject to a host of bureaucratic obstacles, fines, seizure of goods, strictly enforced travel licenses, import and export taxes, which limited the mobility of traders as well as dampened their profit initiative. Unscrupulous Christians could take advantage of a Muslim's vulnerability, as they did in Muhammad's case. Pirates and corsairs plagued both Christians and Muslims alike, making mercantile life for Muslim minorities a precarious business. Yet, as difficult as it may have been to conduct business for Muslim merchants in Christian Spain, research has shown that Mudakhar commercial activity played a fundamental role in Christian Valencia's economy. The Crown of Aragon, as well as Valencia's officials and local merchants, saw the need to protect and encourage Muslim trade and partnership with local Christians. To build a successful merchant enterprise, the merchant elite and the Muslim merchant elite, such as the Ripois in the case above, were compelled to cooperate with Christian bureaucracy and conform to Christian ways of doing business. However successful Mudéjar merchants did their best to cultivate a good reputation in both Christian and Muslim communities, even if good fama might have had a slightly different meaning, as we saw in the episode with the Meribah and Abu Faris. For the Mudéjar merchant, a good reputation among Christians was a prudent defense and a profitable investment. For a Mudéjar merchant's reputation in Islamic lands or among the many Muslims in Valencia, religious fama was just as important. Almsgiving, rescuing captive Muslims, but also respecting contracts. Despite the Meribah's position that business with the infidel was at best low priority, if not forbidden altogether. And we see the same thing in Christian societies with theologians and the Pope's position against business with the infidel. So here I'd like to conclude. Questions of trust, in fact, lie at the root of many of the problems in cross-cultural contexts and exchange. Across the globe, should one rely upon the cooperation of partners, agents, or clients whose behavior cannot be directly monitored? And if so, what conditions? How can the inherent risks to buyers who pay in advance and sellers who offer credit be surmounted? Commercial exchanges across religious groups, geographical and political boundaries have always been risky propositions. This is a statement that Francesca Trivelato writes in a recent introduction to the volume Religion and Trade. And I quote, e-commerce, Bitcoin, the World Trade Organization, and other recent technologies and institutions have solved some problems and created others. Risks were greatest in the pre-industrial period, medieval and early modern, when in order to engage in cross-cultural trade, seafaring vessels and overland convoys often had to overcome tremendous physical obstacles. Marco Polo is only the better known name among a small and audacious group of merchants from Venice and Genoa who made their way to India and China at a time when traveling such distances came with hardships and dangers defying the modern imagination. Once they reached distant markets, merchants had to grapple with strange customs and manners. Little wonder the specialized intermediaries emerged in most towns and ports to facilitate the dealings between strangers. Foreign merchants, however, had to exercise necessary caution while relying on intermediaries who possess insiders' knowledge and may have wished to take advantage of newcomers and passers-by. Defying all odds, merchants across the globe, along with ordinary people, travelers, pilgrims, missionaries, and interlopers, nonetheless concocted ways of bartering and securing credit and establishing durable relations with persons who did not speak their language, wore different garb, and worshiped other gods. Trivelato continues, along docks and caravan routes, in bazaars and city squares, these players acknowledge precious and bulky merchandise. Some of these goods acquire new value when they entered a new environment. They could also be seen as menacing. Religious and secular leaders from around the world that sought to curb tobacco consumption. When the use of this new drug spread rapidly in the early 17th century, while rulers as different as the Safavid Shah and the English crown soon adopted more lenient attitudes. Cross-cultural trade, in other words, was both a boon and a threat to the status quo. For every institution and group that sought to promote it, there would be others that wished to quell it. Guardians of religious orthodoxy were often among those who differentiated between legitimate and illegitimate exchanges. between stigmatized and upright groups, between pure and corrupting commodities. We are reminded here of the Meribah, Abu Faris, Muhammad Rapol, the pious Muslim, and the savvy merchant. Each embrace, for different reasons and in different ways, the importance of cultivating trust in cross-cultural exchange. And Professor Trivolato's reminder that these exchanges of trust and surmounting the commitment problem are both a global issue today, as well as in the Middle Ages. With this, I'd like to end, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Miller, for this wonderfully rich paper. I will open the forum for questions. If you would like to pose your questions in the Q&A window rather than the chat window, please. While we wait, your paper was thought-provoking. It touched upon many topics of giving the big general picture, the big picture, and also zooming in into giving special micro cases and micro studies. I have a few questions, but I'll maybe ask you if you could speak a little bit to this question of what you call the commitment problem, or generating commitment, the problem of generating commitment. And you pose, if I heard you correctly, two models, the trust versus the contract in some way, two models, two poles of the question of generating commitment. And my question is, if you would like to speak a little bit more about the ways in which these two models, if two forms, these two codes, if you like, the trust code and the contract code, overlap sometimes. That is, if you somehow, the contract underwrites the trust, and an unspoken contract maybe, or how trust, in this second case more so, trust is actually necessary for the contracts, especially where some of these contracts were written in different languages and had to be translated into Italian and Spanish and Arabic. And do you really trust those translators exactly, or are they translating the terms of the contract correctly, and so on? So there's always trust and lack of trust, deficit of trust. And then when you want to talk about how these models of trust and contract, and of course you pointed to that, right, when you were, each case was complex, the cases that you talked. Maybe you would like to speak about that.
Sure, that's a wonderful question, and perhaps I was unclear in some ways, because contracts, the reliance on contracts to ensure partnerships and transactions, captive redemption, is a form of trust itself. Is that you trust the legal system, even though the institutions may be different among Christians and Muslims. Arabic contracts versus Christian contracts, they were also contracted together. So it's something that we're all familiar with. You know, a society, a litigious society especially, will pull out the contract and say, you have not abided by everything. It says in the contract here that you're supposed to do this. And in modern system, using law courts, this is all clarified by a judge. So the argument is that for a system to run efficiently, it's necessary to rely on legal institutions. In contrast, some scholars say, well, you know, trust is very, very important, but you only need to have reputable players who have integrity and a good reputation. And it's not necessarily to have the paperwork or the contracts to seal the deal or to ensure that your group stays together, your partnership lasts. Both are options. And then there are other ways, in which partnerships can be arranged. But these are the two fundamental differences. Do you need a legal institution or not? Is it okay just to rely on good reputation? Most of this has been focused on family, for instance, and friendships or co-religionaries within homogeneous groups. That a family is not going to be opportunistic to another family member. But what I am pointing out is that this extends beyond the family. It extends to relationships between Christians and Muslims, absolutely not of the same family and from different countries, different sides of the Mediterranean. Which model applies? Did they support contracts in these Christian-Muslim partnerships? Did they look at just trust? The fakak, who went as intermediaries between the two, were men of integrity. Did people trust them without having to have a contract? One point that I'm making is they were trusted, but they in fact needed to have contracts. Muslims insisted for their fakak. Christians insisted for their fakak. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies it, that they're not necessarily contradictory. It's just two mechanisms that help the system of partnership work better.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There are questions. I thought maybe would you like to speak a little bit to your sources and your actually also your methodology, which was very interesting because you had provided big structure as well as zooming in into giving micro histories where actually things come to life and actually we can see these operations at work. Would you like to speak about those?
Sure, I'd love to. In a way, these are one of the main challenges of my study is the sources, Arabic sources for North Africa and Christian sources for Valencia and other port cities in Europe. Later I'm going to be expanding to Marseille and Venice, are very different. The ones in North Africa tend to be more formal, more formulaic, less detailed, such as the notary formularies that write up contracts for the fakak. Chronicles are also available for North Africa, and a few letters. On the other hand, in Christian lands, the documents available in the archives are much more abundant. We see letters from captives, we see these trial courts of people who may have violated contracts. The evidence is much richer. On the other hand, and very much localized and detailed. So being able to use both these sources, is beneficial, but I have to be careful about how each type of source is read. The letters are one way, they're often dramatic and emotional. And then the court details in Valencia are very specific, describing who the litigants are, and so forth. Whereas in North Africa, the Arabic sources, many things don't survive. Occasionally a contract, signed and dated, but these are only stumbled across, which I've stumbled across one or two, but it's not common. Whereas in the Spanish archives, you would find, lists of such contracts. Yeah.
I don't want to steal away from the questions that have come. If we have, because we have three questions, and I don't know whether you see them. I will read them for you here. Can you speak to the religious duty or responsibility of the traders to incentivize them not to cheat in their dealings? That is, did religious duty had a role in affecting, basically making people behave honestly? That's the question. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, sure. I'd like to first say that, in terms of religious duties, you see that particularly well with the traders who were redeemers, because to actually redeem a captive or to give alms to a captive was a religious deed in both communities, in Christianity and Islam. So they were both doing that for religious reasons. And what I'm pointing out, though, is that the intermediaries also did it for other reasons, not just religious, practical reasons, economic reasons, such as that. Traders would really probably be more concerned with their reputation in their communities if they did not act like a good Christian or act like a good Muslim. But it was less critical, the religious motivations to trade, than it was for the intermediaries, the fakak, to both deal with the religious aspect as well as the practical. So they're deciding back and forth, which we see illustrated quite vividly with the Meribah, even Abu Sununu. He was emphasizing you have a religious duty not to deal with these Christians. You do not have to uphold the contract with your counterpoints. Whereas Abu Faras, as much as he wanted to establish a good reputation among his fellow Muslims, decided to go a different course. He was really interested in the trade context.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask the next two questions at once, if you like to respond to them. The next question is, was there a preference in religious authority or for a trusted person when formalizing contracts? Was there a preference in religious authority? Were religious authority or trusted person preferred when formalizing contracts? And the second question is, was there a difference in the types of trust preferred across different countries? Two very different questions.
These are actually great questions. They're one that I've asked and I'm investigating, especially how they reconcile what may be different conceptions of trust according to Christians and trust according to Muslims. On the other hand, I'm finding that in this particular context of the 14th century, contracts seem increasingly important. While Abner Greif used the Geniza documents, many of you know what they are. It's an incredible store of documents in Cairo of approximately 3 centuries previous. He used these documents, which were largely in Arabic, but how Jews conducted their business in the medieval Mediterranean, and they're very detailed. He feels the contracts may have been less important, and what really worked to keep Jewish traders together was their reputation. They were afraid that if they lost their reputation by, say, selling the price of wheat at a lower price in Cairo, whereas which basically undermined his partnerships with other Jewish traders, would damage him in the long term. He would be kicked out of the group. He would lose his reputation. So that encouraged him how to behave. It was a potential punishment that he just not wanted to encounter. So that's another example that doesn't necessarily involve a contract, but it does involve repercussions. after a so-called, verbal contract or informal contract would be violated? That's a great question. I think the other question on trust is something that I'm still not resolved about. Trust in general is a very, very expansive term and has to be narrowed down to what type of trust we're talking about. And in the late 14th century, I focused specifically on ransoming captives because that will allow us to look more specifically at how the notion of trust operated at that time. And what I'm arguing, and I think other scholars argue this too, is that the notion of trust, which is so broad, really has to be looked at in specific contexts, whether you're talking about China or India. The global crossroads that we're concerned with in the Mediterranean, also the same issues were confronted in other networks and trading routes in other countries and in other empires. And they dealt with it differently than, say, the relations between Tunis and Valencia. And I'll be exploring Genoa and Venice at the same time, as well as Marseille, and see how different they are. But for the most part, in the late 14th century, this notion of trust operates, on the same level in both countries. Further east, studies are still being made on specific contexts. So that's a great question. Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for one more question, which is, would you say that Christians and Muslims dealt as fairly with each other as they did within their groups? Did they dealt as fairly with each other as they did within their groups?
That's great. That's a wonderful question. And if I had time, I would have given one example of whether they were, or how they were dealt with within family. People presume that families or homogeneous groups, most Christians, Muslims and Muslims, would be unified, trust each other, and so forth. But that's not necessarily a case. And there was a case in late 14th century Valencia with a Mudekhar, a Muslim minority, who established a partnership with another family, and they trusted each other. They did that because, as history shows, families trust each other. Partnerships based on family alliances, especially elite merchants, trust each other. And so they were able to conduct long-term trade with North Africa with, the cooperation of these two families. Yet in the end, one of the families betrayed the other family because they decided to serve as a guarantor when one of the families traveled to the Hajj, and they never came back. They stayed abroad. They did not honor their so-called contract. And the family that were left behind in Valencia had to pay the fine. They lost their reputation. A number of things happened. So here we see within a homogeneous group that sometimes priorities took place. In this case, it was a religious priority, the Hajj, and moving away from Christian lands. So yes, it does occur within homogeneous groups. Now, what I'm looking at more specifically is, does it occur often between Muslims and Christians? And my argument is they created a set of institutions that would work well, because at that time, not necessarily 2 centuries later, when the Ottomans and the Portuguese were clashing in the Mediterranean, did they try for mutual institutional cooperation? But in the 14th century and the 15th century, they did, which is why ransoming captives was so relatively calm and efficient and reliable. It's not like that people languished in captives languished in prisons forever. Is, you know, a pirate would say, okay, we're going to pick up these 15 captives, we're going to get the ransom and let them go. So it was much more regular and reliable than later times and sometimes even previous times.
Thank you very much.
So,
I think
thank you for the question.